He waited more than 4 decades to die. 40-plus years of appeals, delays, and watching the world change from behind bars. And when the moment finally came, when the state asked him if he had any final words, he said nothing at all. No apology, no explanation, just one quiet refusal. But that silence only raises more questions. How did a case from the early 1980s stretch all the way into 2025? Why did Florida suddenly rush executions like never before? And what really happened in the final hours of a man who became one of the longest-serving death row inmates in the state's history? To understand that, we have to go back to a summer morning that began like any other, and ended in a crime that would haunt Florida for more than 40 years. June 14, 1982 started out like any ordinary summer morning in the Florida Panhandle. The air was warm, the day felt routine, and nothing about it suggested it would become part of a case people would still be talking about more than 4 decades later. 24-year-old Janet White arrived at the insurance office where she worked, likely thinking about her schedule, maybe lunch plans, maybe getting home to her husband later that evening. It was just another workday, until it wasn't. Not long after, a man walked through the door who didn't stand out at first. No warning signs, no sense of danger, but within moments, everything changed. Janet was forced out of the building and pulled away from safety, deeper and deeper toward the wooded area behind the office. Any chance of help disappeared with every step. What happened in those woods was violent and sudden. She fought back, refusing to give up, but it wasn't enough. Her life ended there, in a place no one could hear her. And when it was over, the man responsible didn't just leave a body behind. He set off a chain reaction that would stretch through courtrooms, prisons, and headlines for the next 40 years. But what stunned people most wasn't just the brutality of the crime, it was how fast the system moved once he was caught. When Kale Bington Bates was brought to trial the following year, the case moved with shocking speed. Prosecutors laid out the evidence, step by step, and from the start it was clear they believed this wasn't a close call. Witness testimony, physical evidence, and the timeline all pointed in the same direction. There were no dramatic twists, no last-minute revelations. To the jury, it felt straightforward. So straightforward, in fact, that deliberations barely lasted an hour. In just about 50 minutes, the jury returned with guilty verdicts on multiple charges, including first-degree murder, kidnapping, and armed robbery. Less time than it takes to finish a TV episode. That alone sent a message about how certain they were. The sentence followed quickly: death. At the time, most people assumed the story was almost over. In the early 1980s, executions were expected to happen within years, not decades. Justice, many believed, would be swift. But instead of moving toward an ending, the case took a sharp turn. Because that death sentence didn't bring closure, it marked the beginning of a legal battle that would stretch on longer than anyone could have imagined. Death row is designed to be a place where time barely moves. But for Kale Bates, time didn't just crawl, it stacked up by the decades. Years turned into milestones he never expected to reach. While he remained locked inside a concrete cell, the world outside transformed in ways no one in 1982 could have predicted. He entered prison when cassette tapes were common and payphones lined the streets. From behind bars, he watched society shift into the digital age. New presidents took office. The internet rewired daily life. Social media changed how people communicated, mourned, and remembered. Meanwhile, his own world stayed almost completely frozen. Somewhere along that stretch of waiting, Bates converted to Islam and adopted a new name. To the prison system, he was still the same inmate number, the same man sentenced to die. But to himself, he was changing, aging, reflecting, redefining who he was in a place where the future felt permanently out of reach. And as the years dragged on, one thing became clear. This wasn't just a case about guilt or innocence anymore. It was becoming a test of how long the system could keep a man suspended between life and death, while his legal team searched for a way out. Behind the scenes, his attorneys were pushing every angle they could find. One of their biggest arguments centered on Bates's mental state. They claimed there were signs of organic brain damage that jurors had never fully considered, something they said should have mattered when deciding whether he deserved the ultimate punishment. Then there was the DNA. His legal team repeatedly asked for modern testing on evidence from the original crime, arguing that newer technology could either confirm guilt beyond doubt or raise serious questions about the case. Each request was shut down. The courts ruled that the existing evidence was enough, and no further testing was necessary. Another claim cut even deeper. Bates's lawyers joined a lawsuit accusing Florida's execution process of racial bias, pointing out a pattern where cases involving white victims appeared to move faster than others. They also highlighted his military service, arguing that a man who once served his country deserved clemency after spending more than 4 decades behind bars. But year after year, the answers came back the same. Denied. Appeals exhausted. Doors closing one by one. And as those final rulings stacked up, it became clear that time was no longer on his side. Because Florida was about to enter a phase no one saw coming. By the time 2025 arrived, something had shifted in Florida. The state began moving through death row cases at a pace it hadn't seen in decades. Executions that once felt distant and uncertain were suddenly being scheduled back to back, turning what was usually a slow process into a rapid one. Bates's case was swept up in that surge. As dates were announced, Florida quietly broke its own records, carrying out more executions in a single year than ever before. Each one added pressure, and with every passing month, it became harder to argue that his sentence would remain theoretical forever. Outside the prison walls, resistance grew. Protesters gathered with candles and signs. Faith groups held vigils, praying for a last-minute reversal. Thousands of people flooded the governor's office with requests for clemency, pointing to Bates's age, his veteran status, and the fact that he had already spent more than 40 years waiting to die. None of it worked. The courts had spoken, and when the governor signed the warrant, the final countdown began. Because the next chapter wouldn't be about appeals or arguments, it would be about the choices made on the very last day. Execution day began before sunrise. At 5:15 that morning, Bates woke up knowing there would be no tomorrow waiting for him. No delays, no more court filings, just hours separating him from the end of a life that had been paused for decades. The Florida Department of Corrections allowed him final visits, and 3 people came to see him: his daughter, his sister, and his brother-in-law. Their time together was quiet and limited, watched closely by guards, with an unspoken clock counting down every second. These were the last moments he would ever share with his family. What surprised many came next. Bates declined a special last meal. No requests. No comfort food. Prison records later noted that he either ate the standard meal or nothing at all. He also chose not to meet with any spiritual advisor. No minister. No imam. Despite his conversion years earlier, he faced his final hours without religious counsel. As the afternoon stretched on, preparations continued around him. Paperwork finalized, witnesses notified, the chamber readied, and while the system moved forward with precision, Bates remained in his cell, waiting for the moment when the door would finally open, and silence would take over. Just before 6 p.m., guards entered his cell and told him it was time. Bates was escorted down the corridor for that final walk, the one every death row inmate knows is coming but can never truly prepare for. The execution chamber at Florida State Prison was already set, quiet and clinical. He was strapped to the gurney, leather restraints secured across his body as IV lines were placed into his arms. On the other side of the glass, witnesses took their seats. Among them was Janet White's husband, a man who had spent more than 40 years waiting for this moment. Media observers sat in silence, ready to record history with pen and paper. When the curtain lifted, the warden asked the question that marks the final pause in every execution: did he have any last words? The room held its breath. This was the moment for apologies, prayers, explanations, anything at all. Bates looked ahead and simply said no. With that, the process began. The chemicals flowed. His breathing quickened, then slowed, then stopped. Within minutes, the man who had waited more than 4 decades for death was completely still. And as the chamber fell quiet once again, the story that had consumed so many lives reached its irreversible end. What happened next depended on who you asked. For Janet White's family, especially her husband who had waited more than 4 decades, this was justice finally delivered. A life taken in a moment of violence in 1982 had at last been answered by the system that promised accountability. For them, the waiting was over. For others, the execution told a very different story. A black military veteran convicted by an all-white jury, denied DNA testing, and kept on death row longer than most people live as free adults. To them, this wasn't closure, it was proof of a system that moves slowly when it should be careful, and quickly when it finally decides to end a life. And then there's the man at the center of it all. A person who declined a final meal, refused spiritual counsel, and offered no last words. Whether that silence meant acceptance, defiance, regret, or something else entirely will never be known. Those answers disappeared the moment the drugs took effect. On August 19, 2025, after more than 15,000 days on death row, Kale Bington Bates' life ended in a prison chamber in Florida. One chapter closed. But the arguments surrounding punishment, justice, and who truly pays the price are far from over. Cases like this ensure that the debate doesn't end with an execution, it only grows louder.